railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. This is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. The 9th of July, 1864. It was 10:10 in the evening and a train was readying for departure from Hackney Station in East London. 2 bank clerks with first-class tickets had just taken seats in the compartment nearest the engine. But as the young men sat down, they realized something was very wrong. The cushions and walls were splattered with blood. A black leather bag lay open on a seat. On the floor was a man's cane topped with a heavy ivory knob. And beside it, a crumpled top hat. Whatever had happened in that first-class compartment had been violent, but no one had heard any cries for help and there was no report of a disturbance. The victim and his attacker had vanished.
It was quite a shock. It was a big sensation at the time. It did put into people's minds doubts about the safety of the railways.
It showed that this new way of travelling was not necessarily safe. You could be stuck in a sealed compartment and come to a very sticky end.
Passengers flocked to the railways in their thousands. The working population of Britain was on the move as never before. But alongside that excitement, this technological innovation also provoked fears.
Victorian society was highly stratified. The class system was just embedded into everything. There were worries with the railways that there would be a sort of rather social promiscuity, the mixing. You know, the baronet might have to sit next to a baker or a boot blackener or a butcher.
Such things didn't worry Mr. Thomas Briggs. In 1864, the 69-year-old banker had an annual season ticket for the North London Railway.
Thomas Briggs was a very well-to-do and quite sort of wealthy man, actually. He was the chief cashier at a bank in the city.
Briggs took the train almost every day, journeying between his home in Hackney and his office at Robarts Curtis Bank in the city. The 9th of July was no different. It was a Saturday, but Briggs was still expected at the office. At 3 p.m, after work, he took an omnibus across London Bridge to pay one of his regular visits to his niece in Peckham. He had dinner with Caroline and her husband, and it was still light when he left at around 8:30. He reached Fenchurch Street Station in time for the 9:45 train. He cheerfully bid the ticket collector good night, then with his cane and his black leather bag in hand, Thomas Briggs clambered into the first-class compartment nearest the engine. A few minutes later, the train was on the move. The empty and bloodied first-class compartment found at Hackney Station was sealed off. Then the train departed just a few minutes late. The police would soon meet it at Chalk Farm, its final stop. By then, another grim discovery had been made. An empty train was returning to Bow Station when its driver spotted something between the tracks. He stopped his engine and sent the stoker and guard out to investigate. And lying on the gravel was the twisted, black-clad body of a man. Thomas Briggs was unconscious, but still alive.
The train driver and the conductor called for help from a nearby pub, and men came out onto the track to help him, and a police officer came from K Division, which was Stepney at the time, and the Metropolitan Police, and they took him to the pub, looked after him, and called the doctor to him.
His head was terribly injured from him either falling, jumping, or being pushed out of the railway carriage.
His wounds were severe. His skull had been caved in. A deep, jagged cut almost sliced his ear clean off. His white beard was stained scarlet with blood. Briggs was identified from letters found in his coat pocket. They carried him first to a nearby pub, and then to his home, a fine Regency townhouse in a Hackney Garden Square. And there, late on the 10th of July, Thomas Briggs died. The Monday papers were full of news of the attack. Briggs had been a gentleman, and he had been murdered while a passenger on the great technological innovation of the age. Scotland Yard Police Commissioner Sir Richard Mayne appointed one of his best men to the investigation. Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was just 31 years old and newly promoted, but he was well respected for his hard work and keen eye for the crucial lead. The family of Thomas Briggs had identified the cane and the black leather bag found in the compartment. They had belonged to the slain man. But the hat? Briggs wore a silk top hat made by expert craftsmen in the City of London. His family didn't recognise the crumpled beaver hat at all.
Thomas Briggs bought his hats at £1 a time from a hatter in the City of London. They were silk top hats. This was different.
This beaver hat that was found was only about 8 and sixpence or 10 and sixpence in actually price. It was a much cheaper hat than Mr. Briggs's normal hat.
Find the owner of the crumpled top hat, and Inspector Tanner would find the killer. He soon got an early breakthrough. Thomas Briggs had owned a heavy, old-fashioned watch with a gold case and chain, but it was missing after the attack. A description of it was circulated to the newspapers, where it was seen by jeweller John Death. Death claimed a gold chain, like the one belonging to Thomas Briggs, had been exchanged in his shop on the Monday after the murder. The customer had been a young, clean-shaven man with a foreign accent. He had picked out a cheaper, more modern chain, as well as a signet ring. Death had packed the chain in a small cardboard box, stamped with his shop's address.
John Death had never seen the young man before, and he described him as about 30. He thought he was German, and he noticed that all the time that he was sort of valuing the chain, the young man was sort of turning this way and that, so as to stop a really clear impression being taken of him.
The police took away the heavy, old-fashioned chain as evidence. It was quickly identified as belonging to Thomas Briggs. Inspector Tanner now had a possible suspect, but he had no name and only the vaguest of descriptions. He needed more. Thomas Briggs' employers at the Robarts Curtis Bank put up £100 as a reward for information. The government matched it, as did the North London Railway Company. Posters were plastered across the capital. But days passed with no further breakthrough. Tanner knew with each day that passed, the crime was less likely to be solved. His investigation was in trouble.
London was a multicultural city. It had always embraced immigrants. The presence of a German wasn't in and of itself particularly strange. It certainly wouldn't have flagged up, oh, but he's probably a murderer, what on earth was a German doing?
It left the police still looking for a needle in a haystack.
By the 18th of July, almost 10 days had passed since the murder of Thomas Briggs. The victim had been buried, but the case was far from solved. Then, at 11:15 that evening, a man walked into a police station in Marylebone and reignited the hunt for the killer. Jonathan Matthews was a Hackney carriage driver. He told police that on the Monday after the murder, a young German friend had paid him a call. His name was Franz Müller. He was 23, a tailor, who was particularly fond of his black beaver hat. As they spoke, Müller had given Matthews' daughter a box to play with, and printed on the lid was the name and address of the jeweller John Death.
This was the big breakthrough.
The police, who were under huge pressure to come up with a solution, have something.
Yes, the box had come from the jeweller's shop. Yes, the chain and the ring had been placed in the box. But best of all, Matthews was even able to provide a photograph. This really opened up the case now.
Tanner had his lead at last. There was just one problem. The reason Franz Müller had visited Jonathan Matthews. He'd come to say goodbye before leaving for America. In 1864, the Grinnell and Company shipping line offered some of the cheapest fares to America, and it wasn't hard to see why. The Victoria was an old-fashioned sailing ship. Steerage passengers paid just £4 to cross the Atlantic, but their quarters were cramped and uncomfortable. They had to prepare their own meals, and the passage would take 19 days, if they were lucky. Among the passengers enjoying the Victoria's meagre comforts in July 1864 was a young tailor. He was leaving his troubles behind, he thought, heading for a new start in the new world.
Franz Müller had come over to London. He was known as quite a polite young man. He hadn't caused any problems. He wasn't a violent man.
Müller's journey to New York was even slower than expected. The winds were against them. After more than 2 weeks at sea, the Victoria had barely escaped the coast of Ireland. The vast Atlantic still lay ahead. All Müller had to do was get to America. Once he was there, he must have thought he would be free.
There's every chance he could have become anonymous, melted into the crowd. It was a huge, huge, huge country.
As the Victoria struggled across the Atlantic, in London, Detective Inspector Richard Tanner was in a race against time. If he planned to arrest Müller in America and bring him back, Tanner would need an extradition agreement, and to get that, he needed more evidence.
So Tanner is caught in a really tense race against time because Müller is bobbing across the Atlantic Ocean very slowly in his boat, the Victoria. And Tanner's aware he's got to compile all this evidence that can present a watertight case, and he's also got to make sure that the extradition process is going to be effective at the other end.
Armed with a photograph of Müller, Inspector Tanner hurried once more to the jeweller John Death. Death confirmed it. That was definitely the man who had come into his shop to exchange the gold watch chain. Tanner rushed all over London. He spoke to Müller's landlady, his friend, his employer. He was building up a sketch of a vain and boastful young man, a young man desperate for money to cross the Atlantic, a young man who, shortly after the murder of Thomas Briggs, was seen with a fine new top hat.
The inquiries showed that Franz Muller had actually bought a ticket at London docks on the Tuesday of that week, and he'd set sail on the Thursday.
Suddenly the case acquired a great urgency, and the hunt for Muller began.
The witnesses were hurried to Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Depositions were taken and the evidence heard. By 6 o'clock on the 19th of July, a warrant had been issued for Muller's arrest. Tanner had gathered everything he could. There was no more time. Late that evening, the exhausted inspector boarded an express train bound for Liverpool. With him were Detective Sergeant George Clark, the jeweller John Death, and the cabman Jonathan Matthews. They had tickets booked on a fast transatlantic steamer leaving the next morning.
But he had to go himself, and he had to get there before the Victoria landed.
The huge advantage that the British had was that they could use the expensive means of travelling using a steam-powered vessel rather than a sailing vessel.
Tanner arrived in New York on the 5th of August. Muller may have had a 5-day head start, but Tanner reached America first. The police inspector was relieved. There was still much for him to do. Tanner waited and waited. Colleagues from London arrived on another boat with more paperwork for the extradition. But still, there was no sign of Muller. Had Muller's ship been lost at sea? Had it been forced into another port? Might Muller escape them after all? With each day, Tanner's worries grew until, finally, on the 24th of August, the Victoria was spotted off the coast. It had been at sea almost 6 weeks. Tanner's long, stifling wait in New York was at an end. At last, the winds were carrying his quarry into port. Franz Muller was seized by American police before his ship had even docked. He flatly denied any involvement in the murder of Thomas Briggs. He never was on that train at all, he insisted. Now, a court in New York had to decide whether Detective Inspector Tanner had the evidence to prove otherwise.
Franz Muller was arrested, taken into custody, and he appeared before Mr. Newton, who was the commissioner at New York, who had this court hearing to decide whether Franz Muller was going to be extradited and sent back in custody to Britain to face trial.
There was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Muller from the immigrant community and hostility towards Britain, so it was going to be difficult.
With the extradition order secured on the 3rd of September, Tanner escorted Muller onto the steamship Etna. They left New York and America behind and set out once more into the Atlantic. The murder of Thomas Briggs had become a sensation in the British press. In Liverpool, a crowd awaited Muller's arrival. In the eyes of many, the young German was already guilty.
The British public were intensely fascinated by the case because this was the first ever railway murder.
Despite investigators' best efforts, they found no one who could place Muller at the scene of the crime. And there were at least 5 witnesses who spoke of seeing 2 other men in the compartment with Briggs, and neither matched the description of Franz Muller. But this information was not shared with the defence. The police were then under no obligation to do so. In 1864, the deck was stacked against the accused. There was no appeals court. The defendant was barred from giving evidence, and even his counsel was not allowed to sum up the defense to the jury at the end of the trial. Franz Müller's trial began at the Old Bailey on the 27th of October 1864. 12 men would decide his fate. Over the next 3 days, they heard how the crushed beaver hat found in the blooded compartment matched one belonging to Müller. They heard about the hat he had with him in New York, which was silk and cut down in the crown to alter its height. And they heard how police discovered in Müller's luggage a piece of cloth sewn into a pouch and tied in a ribbon. Inside was Thomas Briggs' missing gold watch.
All the defence counsel could do was try and attack the prosecution's witnesses. Jonathan Matthew, the hansom cab driver, he was particularly savaged by defence counsel over a 21-day sentence that he'd served for a minor theft many, many years ago.
There was sort of defence witness. One of them, or at least one of them, said that they thought that Thomas Briggs had been in the compartment with 2 men on that night.
The jury took just 15 minutes to make their decision. Müller was guilty. The judge donned the black cap and sentenced him to death. Early on the morning of the 14th of November 1864, a gallows was erected outside Newgate Jail. Heavy rain was falling, but that didn't put off the crowds. They gathered in their tens of thousands to watch Franz Müller die. A few minutes before 8 o'clock, with the prison bell ringing, the condemned man was led out. The crowd roared as Müller, pale and trembling, climbed the scaffold. His legs were strapped, the noose placed around his neck, and a white hood pulled down over his face. Moments before the trapdoor gaped beneath his feet, the 24-year-old spoke in an urgent whisper to the German pastor beside him. Ich habe es getan, he said. Ich habe es allein getan. Ich habe keine Mitschuldigen. I did it. I did it alone. I have no accomplice. Then the trapdoor opened and Müller fell. After months of denying involvement in the crime, Müller had confessed. But mysteries remained. What actually happened in the first-class compartment that summer night? Had Müller planned the robbery, or did he act on impulse? Did he mean to kill Thomas Briggs by throwing him off the train? Or did the old man fall trying to escape?